requires state-regulated private health insurance companies to cover up to $40,000 annually for screenings and therapy for children with autism spectrum disorders. The bill affects only the state-regulated companies which serve the small and medium-sized businesses in the state and are about 40% of the insurance market. There are a few reasons why this bill is bad. Number one, health insurance mandates raise the cost of health insurance for everyone. This includes families with children who do not have state-protected illnesses. Depending on which side you ask, the bill will increase premiums 1%, 3%, or 5%. It will increase premiums though, and any increase in premium cost will price out some businesses or individuals from their current insurance coverage. Secondly, the bill establishes a board to certify applied behavior analysts who administer the expensive therapy that the bill covers. This further regulation will raise the cost of ABA therapy and add extra barriers and hoops to become an analyst. For those who are not covered under this mandate, this will raise their costs. Also, even if someone thinks this is a necessary provision, it will only affect an estimated 20% of families who have children with autism. That means the 1% or more increase in insurance premiums will come at a very small gain for families in Missouri. The bill has some redeeming qualities, though. If the provisions in the bill demonstrably raise premiums at least 2.5% for small and medium-sized businesses, they can opt out. But small businesses are particularly cost-sensitive. Whether 2.5% is the cutoff for dropping health insurance for the small business or not, it will raise the cost of doing business in Missouri. This could translate into higher prices, fewer jobs, or fewer people with health insurance. It is easy to be swept up by the emotional stories of families who have children with autism. The good intentions of this bill, though, will have very negative consequences. It is not possible to mandate coverage for every potential condition, and those without state-protected illnesses face the cost of these mandates. A better solution would be to increase competition in the health insurance market so that insurance companies are more responsive to their customers, so they will cater to these niche markets. Removing the employer tax benefit or increasing the use of health savings accounts are two ways to improve competition. While that bill raises costs in medical licensing regulation, another bill in the legislature lowered them. The Emergency Services Bill, House Bill 1977, passed with relatively little press coverage. It's far from perfect, but it does have some good points. The bill does two things. First, it changes the requirements for ambulance personnel so that emergency medical technician intermediates are able to do more than they were before. Secondly, it requires every ambulance and stretcher van to carry an automated external defibrillator, an AED. What I liked about this bill was its changes to the requirements for EMT intermediates. There are three main levels of EMTs: basic, intermediate, and paramedic. Before the bill, ambulances needed 2 paramedics on board. I talked with the bill's sponsor, Representative Jay Wasson, and he said the impetus for the bill was that rural areas were having problems staffing ambulance in areas where there were not enough paramedics. The new bill will allow EMT intermediates to take on more of the paramedic role. This will lower the cost of operating these ambulances, which will allow more of them to operate. In urban areas, there probably won't be a very large change, except that there will be the option to lower the cost of ambulances when necessary. Overall, this deregulation of the EMT profession should allow more ambulances to be available in a more cost-effective manner. As I said previously, mandates raise costs, and requiring AEDs on ambulances will raise the cost of ambulances that do not already have them. All things considered, though, this is not an unreasonable mandate. When a person suffers cardiac arrest, CPR and defibrillation can stimulate their heart again. This needs to happen within the first 4 to 7 minutes after cardiac arrest before the patient will suffer brain damage. When one considers that cardiac arrests are one of the most common calls for an ambulance and that 1/3 of Missouri deaths in 2008 were heart-related, it's not unreasonable to assume that first responders will have the most basic equipment on board. Overall, though, the EMT provisions will lower the cost of operating an ambulance in Missouri and will hopefully improve emergency response time because of it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So like Caitlin, I'm going to start off with the bad bill, try to get the bad news out of the way. I selected the agricultural bill as my bad bill, not because this is everything that most government bills are, that favors some small interest groups at the expense of the rest of society. Probably the most controversial part of the bill is something that did not actually end up making it into the final bill. There was a provision that was going to allow subsidies. Essentially, the state would pay inspectors to go around and inspect horse slaughterhouses. A lot of people objected to this on moral grounds. My main objection is I do not want subsidies used for any agricultural products, whether it be horse slaughtering, cow slaughtering, doesn't really matter. We do not need subsidies for these sorts of things. But fortunately, that did not make it into the bill. However, there are still many negative things that did make it into the bill. For instance, there is now a licensing program for egg producers and dealers. These aren't particularly high, but $50 for egg dealers and $100 for egg processors for a license. Nonetheless, that is those costs will keep out some competition and cause prices for eggs to go up. So this is it's completely unnecessary, and the money that is generated by these licenses is going to be used for what amounts to a slush fund for the agriculture department that they will be able to use for generally whatever they would like to use it for, which I would prefer to have it more restricted to specific items as opposed to just some random fund that can be used for whatever purposes they like. Perhaps the worst part of the bill is it creates something called the Farm to Institution Initiative, which will use tax dollars to promote locally grown agriculture and push this on schools. So public schools in Missouri will be forced to buy locally made agricultural goods. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with locally made agricultural goods, but if it was cheap to buy them, schools would already be buying them now. This is going to raise prices for school lunches, and ultimately we're either going to have less money to spend on education, or we're going to have to raise property taxes to pay for this. So local farmers will be subsidized at the expense of society at large, or at the expense of children's educations. There's nothing good about that. In 2020, 10% of food in cafeterias will have to come from local sources, and by 2028 that number rises to 20%. This is basically just central planning for our food system, and it's completely unnecessary. As the 19th century French economist and legislator once noted, he said that, there is no central administrator to determine, who will feed Paris, yet Paris does get fed. So this is a completely unnecessary bill, as are pretty much every agricultural bill, whether it's in Missouri, nationwide, any other state. They're almost always a waste of tax dollars. Now, unfortunately, the good bill that I have isn't all that good either. It says a lot more about how bad the legislative session was that I've chosen this than that this is how good of a bill it actually is. But it's the Healthcare Freedom Act, which will allow Missouri voters to vote on whether they approve of the new federal health insurance reform. Now, the problem is that this has been greatly watered down. Originally, it was going to be a constitutional amendment that the voters in Missouri would get to vote on, but now it's just a state law. My colleague Dave Rowland, who is a legal scholar, has written that a constitutional amendment might have the force to restrain the federal government. That might actually stand up to constitutional muster at the Supreme Court. But a simple state law is going to easily be trumped by federal law, and so ultimately this is not going to have any effect. So why did I choose it then? Why is this good in any way? Well, if we want to return the federal government to one of specifically enumerated powers, one that doesn't just have the right to do whatever it pleases and just cite the Commerce Clause, then the states are going to have to start reasserting their traditional rights. And so the state, even if we don't want the state government involved in healthcare, it's better that they're involved than the federal government's involved. So we want them to come in and step in front of the federal government and disallow them from being able to assert authority over So this bill might be some small step to returning more power to the states and hopefully ultimately to the people, as opposed to just expanding federal power more and more until we just have one government that controls everything. Thank you very much.
I think we too often place our faith in the legislative process as a mechanism that can solve all our problems for us. Most bills, frankly, don't deserve to be passed. It's true there are good bills, but even the best ones generally scale back prior overreaching of government. So, with that in mind, instead of talking about what my favorite bill of the session is, or what I think the worst is, instead I'd like to talk about what I think is the most interesting legislative debate of the past session, which is the wrangling over tax credits in Missouri for economic development purposes specifically. There's been a lot of debate over who gets, which package of tax incentives, which businesses are we going to reward, which ones are going to lose out. There are a few good parts of the debate in the sense that people wanted to pass sunset provisions, change maybe some of the oversight procedures. But overall, the debate sort of missed the point, which is that government officials aren't in a position to determine which businesses are likely to become a better investment for the people of Missouri. David Friedman, son of Milton Friedman, the Nobel laureate economist and famed economist in his own right, once wrote about special interest politics by saying, "It's a simple game. 100 people sit in a circle, each with his pocket full of pennies. A politician walks around the outside of the circle, taking a penny for each person. No one minds. Who cares about a penny? When he has gotten all the way around the circle, the politician throws 50 cents down in front of one person who is overjoyed at the unexpected windfall. The process is repeated, ending with a different person. After 100 rounds, everyone is 100 cents poorer, 50 cents richer, and happy." This is essentially the game we face with the use of tax credits for economic development. Officials gamble with taxpayer money in the hopes that the industry they court will be the next big thing and disproportionately grow the economy. But public officials have no special talent for picking successful forms of investment. As another Nobel laureate economist, Friedrich Hayek, wrote in 1945, "The peculiar character of the problem of rational economic order is determined precisely by the fact that the knowledge of the circumstances of which we must make use never exists in concentrated or integrated form, but solely as the dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge which all the separate individuals possess." Central authorities, legislators, public officials of any stripe aren't in a position to manage the economy with any success, both because they have limited information to all the distributed information that's in the economy, and because every dollar spent by the government on one sector of the economy must necessarily be taken from another sector of the economy, thereby dampening marginal economic growth there. John earlier mentioned 19th century economist Frederick Bastiat. I'd like to, one of his more famous quotes is when he said, "There is only one difference between a bad economist and a good one. The bad economist confines himself to the visible effect. The good economist takes into account the effects that can be seen, both the effect that can be seen and the effects that must be foreseen." So when we see a big new factory being created in Missouri, that's something that we can see. It's a very obvious visible effect of the economic development tax credits. And much like the windfall of pennies mentioned by David Friedman, it impresses special interests and even the voters, which is why public officials find it such an attractive economic strategy. They can be seen as having created jobs. But creating jobs is beside the point. If we create efficiency, the money that is no longer devoted to waste or redundancy can be spent productively instead. Reducing inefficiency and saving money is the real road to prosperity. When we hand out incentives to targeted industries, we shortchange the taxpayers by encouraging an inefficient form of economic investment. By lowering tax rates across the board, however, we can create a climate that's favorable to economic investment of many kinds, allowing capital to seek more efficient and more productive uses. Only by allowing the dispersed knowledge of a diverse market to find its own levels of risk and potential reward can we create the kinds of jobs that Missourians really need: productive, efficient, and dynamic. The only mechanism by which government officials can successfully encourage economic development is by getting out of the way and letting the market work. Thank you.
Anyway, I'm here right now to talk about House Bill 2226. That's it's my good bill and my bad bill.
It relates to licensing. Makes some steps in the right direction, has some neutral steps, and also goes in the bad direction as well. So I'll start with the right direction. It does recognize some licenses from other states. At one point in particular, the bill exempts a person from licensure as a nurse in Missouri if he or she holds an out-of-state license and he or she is only passing through for 48 hours. And they're just transporting someone. So at least it's an improvement. And it also adds advanced practice registered nurses to the list of approved healthcare providers who are authorized to write a prescription to refer patients to a physical therapist. And there are some positive consequences of these two points in the bill. It's a really long, comprehensive bill. This increases access for patients. It decreases the cost of healthcare, usually, most obviously in the form of increased labor costs. Licensing increases labor costs, and it decreases barriers to entry in the industry. So, although it's small, at least a nurse doesn't have to go through a lot of education to just cut through the state. And as Caitlin Hartson described in an editorial earlier this year that related to dental hygienists and licensing in that occupation, opening the market to unlicensed healthcare professionals will provide more than just quality, affordable healthcare. It will also provide skilled jobs, particularly in rural communities that usually have trouble attracting professional dentists and other nurses to locate their work. So now it steps in the wrong direction where, unfortunately, very more. It ruins the exemption for licensure as a private investigator if there is an employer-employee relationship available. Stokes knows more about this from his past life, but there's a lot of nuanced policies here that relate to this. It also requires all contracts sold by cemetery operators for cemetery services or for graves, cemetery markers, crypts, and other burial receptacles to meet certain requirements. And it also raises fees for non-compliance, so this is another way in which occupational license increases the cost of delivery services. And it also requires all dental hygienists and dental assistants to obtain a permit from the Missouri Dental Board within the department in order to perform expanded functions duties. So it kind of actually negates the first benefit. And it also increases the requirement to be a marital or family therapist. This one I actually thought was kind of comically dense, so I'd like to read this. So it requires that within the department is authorized to issue a provisional license to a person who is a graduate of a specified acceptable higher education institution with at least a master's degree in marital and family therapy or its equivalent, and it meets all the requirements of a licensed marital or family therapist other than the specified required supervised clinical experience if he or she is supervised by a qualified person as defined by the Rural Committee. So, if you want to be a marital or family therapist in Missouri, there are some very strong barriers to entry there. And so, this increases the cost of doing business, as I initially alluded, in mostly the form of higher staffing requirements, sometimes non-compliance fees. Now, patients have to see a physician or a dentist for things that a physician's assistant or dental assistant could otherwise do at a lesser cost. So this negatively affects people of lower incomes or in rural areas who could probably otherwise see it. And it discourages individuals from entering the market by creating a significant barrier and favors those who are currently in the market. In fact, those who are established in an occupation usually support licensing in that occupation because it creates them, it protects them from future competition. And finally, licensing, stronger occupational licensing has the unintended consequence of driving some marginal number of people towards other alternatives. So licensing actually, unfortunately, does not usually accomplish its intentions, such as improving safety or health, because these increased costs will in turn cause some other people to elect to forego these services. So I do have a Simon Rothberg quotation that I think kind of sums up what I'm trying to say. This is from David Stokes' puts in I guess the board that approves these, there's certain occupations that just submits this. So, thank you.
It's appropriate for Dave to introduce me with a transparency tool that we produce, because my good bill is about an effort to advance government transparency. The bill I want to talk about this year, at this time, was House Bill 1444, which, if the government signs it, will require local government agencies to give earlier notice of meetings where a vote will be held either to increase taxes or to authorize the use of eminent domain for a private development. This also includes authorizing the creation of a transportation development district, which increases sales taxes in a small specific area, as well as the use of tax increment financing, which is the use of public funds to further a private development. Earlier notice is important. Prior to this bill, government agencies only had to give 24 hours notice before increasing taxes or approving the use of eminent domain. Now they have to give 4 days. Though 4 days isn't especially long, it will give citizens the opportunity to organize against what they perceive as a bad expenditure of public funds or unnecessary use of eminent domain. Additionally, 4 days is not a burdensome amount of time. This reporting requirement won't muck up the bureaucratic timeline needed to get things done. Interestingly, this bill, is originally submitted by Representative Timothy Jones, included a provision that explicitly stated that members of the public would be allotted a period of time to comment. A period of time to comment. I want to stress that. The version that passed merely states that members of the public would have an opportunity to be heard. Perhaps my trepidation is a little unwarranted, but when the wording is changed from a period of time to just the opportunity, I'm reminded of a recent tax increment financing commission meeting in St. Louis, where there wasn't enough time to be heard, and half of the people who had to speak merely submitted written comments that were not read at any time. So though they had the opportunity to be, I guess, heard or voice their opinion, it wasn't actually recognized. I should also note that this bill was, that the sponsor of this bill, Representative Jones, has been working with the Missouri Press Association on bills that would expand the reporting requirements of government agencies. Last year, I wrote about a bill that he sponsored that would have required government agencies to keep more detailed minutes of public meetings, and it passed. I commend these efforts to make local government transparent and more accessible to Missouri citizens. The bill I wanted to highlight as being less than stellar is actually, for the most part, a good bill. I chose Senate Bill 928, which tweaks the state sales tax law. The bill basically exempts resale purchases from the sales tax. As former Representative Ed Robb spoke at the recent Show Me Forum, this is in essence a pretty good thing. We don't want to tax something twice. No new economic activity is generated just through the resale of a used object. And as Senator Brett Lager's initial version, this was where the bill stopped. But what I wanted to highlight as bad is a sales tax exemption that was added later on. The truly agreed to and finally passed version includes a sales tax exemption. This particular exemption is for clays and trap targets sold to shooting ranges. I realize that in the grand scheme of things, this is pretty small. But it certainly wasn't created because of an economic benefit to the state. As noted in the paper about the Missouri sales tax by Dr. Hassler, there are already more than 140 exemptions to the state sales tax, many of which were created under pressure from special interest groups. Some examples are the sales of animals purchased for breeding, newsprint ink and other materials used in newspaper production, computers and computer software purchased by architectural or engineering firms headquartered in the state. This is just some of them. There are 140 more. As Dr. Hassler has demonstrated previously, a broad lower sales tax would be best for the state economy. Carving certain purchases out from the sales tax base results in a higher tax rate for the rest.
Thank you very much, Audrey. And now I'd like to just open up the floor to questions for our panel here. And that one's going to be Tom.
Yeah, my question is for you, John, about the agriculture bill. You said that it actually requires that funds be used to promote locally grown food. Is that, first of all, is that dealing with funds that are already controlled by the State Department of Agriculture? And then my other question is,
yes, I assume they would have to be using funds that they already control. But as far as the mechanism, it's kind of broad. You know, there it says this institution will work with farmers and with marketers, and so it's not exactly clear what they're going to do. But the main thing is that they're going to force schools to start buying food from locally grown sources, and so that, you know, if it were cheap to do that, they would already be doing it now. So this is probably where they're going to, the subsidy is just in forcing people to do it. So that will subsidize the farmers.
Question, sir?
Question about financing for economic development. What would our competitive situation be with respect to other states if we stop doing that?
Our competitive situation is essentially granting a big package of incentives to any specific industry is a losing game for everybody involved. If we want to maintain a competitive environment for business, we need to lower tax rates across the board, which helps to encourage all kinds of economic development. When we essentially trying to bring any targeted industry to Missouri through the use of any kind of incentive like tax credits is putting all our eggs in one basket. Even if we do it for several industries, putting our eggs in a few baskets is still not enough. Essentially, there's no way public officials can predict which industry is going to be the big payoff for their state. And the track record has shown that they generally pick businesses that haven't been as successful as they've hoped, and don't end up bringing the money to Missouri that they had hoped would, and don't always end up getting all of the money that they forewent in tax credits back.
Don't you have to buy, pay for Toyota to come in or some other company like that?
Yeah, you might not.
Improving a business climate is terrific, but it takes time. It ain't going to happen, right?
Right, but
So
what exactly is Toyota going to do for us, especially if they're not paying into the tax system? Any individual company isn't going to save Missouri's economy. It's only going to be the widely dispersed economic activity of everybody having a little bit more money in their pocket to spend, encouraging industry of all types.
Let me ask a question to build on that. The Missouri fair tax legislation is banging around the fair, and it seems to me that if that bill passed, it would end a lot of the perniciousness that you find in all these tax credits, and I think it would also attract a lot of outside business into Missouri because they would, in essence, avoid a lot of these taxes that are keeping them away right now. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have no comment in particular on any particular version of the fair tax legislation, but I would agree in general that sort of a broader and more marginally lower sales tax rate would create a better economic climate for developing business.
Dr. Grigorski?
I have a question. You know, when I hear about these tax credits, I keep hearing that we don't know how many are out there. Is that really, how can we not know that? Can someone explain that to me? Yeah, you can try.
we do know.
We do know. Right, I mean, how, okay. So that's just not correct reporting? Would someone?
It's politically attractive, and like our speakers, the proponent of that position will say that because it sounds attractive and it's philosophically consistent with the audience, but the fact is it just isn't true. We do know how many there are. We do know which ones are successful and which ones aren't successful.
Well, what do you mean? How do you know which one's successful and not successful?
Well, when I say successful, I mean they have produced at least locally viable economic activity. Whether the economic activity is a net benefit to the state or the nation is, of course, the big philosophical question here, isn't it? But we do know that they produced something good in Kabul, for example. things which produced economic activity. Philosophically, one can certainly argue that even if they produce his 50 cents, they cost more pennies somewhere else. And whether that's true or not, it's a conclusion rather than a fact. It's unknowable.
Chris, can I substitute one word for you?
Sure.
You use philosophically. I think what is important is quantitative. What we're really looking for is whether the evidence verifies whether this is quantitatively a net.
I agree with that 100%.
So I'm just going to, it's philosophically makes it seem
I agree.
real.
I agree.
One reason why, because we've had in office tax credits.
Pull the mic closer.
Oh, thank you. One reason why I oppose them largely is because taxpayers are poorer by the amount of subsidy. So, for example, when you pay IBM to $28 million to have them located within your state, actually, $31 million if you consider the local incentives as well, to bring 600 jobs in. You're subsidizing those jobs by, I think it's like $51,000 per job. And so that's money that can't be spent on other things. It's another Bastiat style analysis. It can't be spent on education or infrastructure. And we're facing a $500 million deficit in the state anyway. So it's and then another thing is these incentive packages are also the property taxes abated, so they're not going to be contributing property or sales tax revenue in the future. So you're missing out on future revenues as.
Now, the other thing, if I can add to that, is that in some cases, probably not all cases, it provides a competitive advantage for some company to come in from out of state against, companies that have been here, small businesses that have been here competing, that have been paying these taxes, and now all of a sudden, some stranger comes into town and he doesn't have to pay all that. That's totally unfair. You talk about level playing field, you want to level the playing field, but that doesn't level it. I think what it does is puts it at a disadvantage small business owners who are already struggling to make ends meet, and then lo and behold, they got a new guy here that doesn't have to. They can produce a product cheaper than he can now. So it's totally absurd, and I don't know if we know who they all are or not. But that's something I would be proud of, knowing who all these guys are. I think we ought to work, in the State House to try to eliminate tax credits. They're pernicious. They can almost never be justified. I suppose if you had some industry out there that would be real lucrative to Missouri and nobody in the world could do it but them, then they might be able to justify it. But otherwise, I think it's a bad deal.
But also, if that were true, we wouldn't need the tax credits to attract that particular business to Missouri.
Well, that points to a bigger problem, and that is that our whole tax system is bankrupt.
If I could just jump in, if anyone here is interested in examining what tax credits were handed out in what year, not in terms of awarded, but what were actually paid out, showmeliving.org, our tool will grab your show. To answer that point, I was talking with some St. Louis area journalists last week, and I know that the $500 million number is bandied about
state auditor, Susan Monti, recently released a report about some of the top Missouri tax credits, and they found that they did not produce as much economic development as they had anticipated and cost more than they had said they would cost.
Representative Pell?
Thank you. I'd like to ask the young man who used the Healthcare Freedom Act as the example of this good legislation. Why would you pick that over the resolution to Congress calling on Congress to submit a balanced budget constitutional amendment to the state? The second actually does something which is absolutely consistent with both your personal philosophy and the philosophy of your employer. And that is the national federal budget. Why wasn't that the best act in the General Assembly this year?
I will say, I suppose I just was not aware of it, but that sounds good to me too. I like that, and I definitely want, any bill that has state legislatures asserting to the federal government, look, we need to rein the federal government back in and make it accountable to the states and to the people, as opposed to just completely able to do anything and just cite the Commerce Clause and just say, well, that gives us power to do everything in the world. Well, we need something that is going to restrain that.
See, when you go with those other things, you encourage all that 10th Amendment gibberish, which is only conversation, whereas the only significant way to restrain the federal government is by restraining the power of the purse. And the only way to do that is to require a balanced federal budget.
Of course, the Healthcare Freedom Act started out as a constitutional amendment.
But it never had any real, even in the Constitution, it would have no actual governmental meaning. At no point would it ever be meaningful, whereas the balanced budget would be meaningful from the first day.
It would, but that was only a resolution that was considered.
Not so. It is a resolution, but the reason it's important is because if only 2 more states call on Congress to send a balanced budget, constitutional amendment, Congress is required by the Constitution to do so. That's why I believe it is important that we ask the Congress to send to us a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced federal budget.
Well, I think, you're just basically saying that, you don't agree with the favorite that you pick. But I don't think it's either or. It's
No,
both.
I agree.
It's both,
I was just being rhetorical.
Mr. Calzone, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess I did. I was wondering if you looked at all at any of the legislation that was considered that didn't pass, maybe almost passed. And I looked very closely at the ethics bill in the final hours of session. And did you take a look at that at all? So the elements of the ethics bill as it passed the House, but then failed to pass the Senate.
Can I?
Is this to the whole panel? Or?
Yeah, anybody that looked at the ethics bill.
I will say I did not look at it.
Well, the general question, I think Ron's saying, did you look at the bills that, the disasters that were averted? Barely, sir, because
Barely averted.
barely averted, because there were really a couple of disasters. One, trying to make it almost impossible to have a statewide ballot initiative. You wiped that out, and you've just wiped out citizens' access to government. And that came, frankly, some leadership just got involved and said this thing's not moving forward. And there may have been a few others. And then there's some great bills that didn't make it, like putting on the ballot the measure to eliminate the state income tax and replace it with a broad-based retail sales tax. But at least it got debated in the Senate. And what I've learned since I've been back is the Senate in Missouri is the place where bills go to die. Anything in particular? Pardon me? Anything in particular, Mr. Superintendent? Yeah, that one. Tax reform.
My primary role as a citizen lobbyist is to kill legislation. I do find it easier to kill it in the Senate. Not the legislation you're talking about, but the single element in the ethics bill that goes along with your concerns about citizen involvement was the provision that passed the House that was going to say that if you attempted to influence was the exact language, a legislator other than your own, you would have to register as a lobbyist. And if you failed to register as a lobbyist, and you knew that you were supposed to, you could be convicted of a Class D felony. So that means that if I'd have to be very careful what I Senate, but it did pass the House. And once again, it was, and I think that maybe that speaks to a greater problem that we had with the process. Did you look at all of the process, for instance, the power of the Rules Committee, and its effect on legislative process?
I will say that I think that could be an interesting case to test judicially, the lobbyist registration requirement. It would be interesting if that were tried by the Supreme Court and struck down later. But yeah, it's not a case they should be hearing, but it would be nice to set that precedent.
Dave, over here.
I do understand that Dave Rowland, the Show Me Institute analyst, covered the ethics bill closely at the Show Me Institute. He was unable to be here today. Back into person.
With an example like that one, are there sort of well-intentioned reformers that really believe that's a good idea? Or is it just some, where do ideas like that come from? How does it end up in a bill? I mean, who supports, it seems so foolish on its face and unconstitutional. Where do things like that come from? What group wants that?
Well, I will say that there's sort of a general tendency among the electorate to be wary of special interests in politics, which they should be. But it's not because people have special interests, it's because legislators have the power to regulate all manner of things that shouldn't be part of government purview. When legislators have that power to regulate, people will seek out ways to influence that power. Lobbyists are only a symptom of the problem. They're not the problem themselves.
Well, I think maybe to address where that sort of thing's coming from, Chris mentioned the Healthcare Freedom Act. That was a grassroots-driven piece of legislation. And the fact of the matter is that everyday citizens, just like you all, have had more and more influence on people that are trying to accumulate power into relatively few hands. It's beginning to have an effect. And I think that there are people that want to squelch average citizens from being involved. Maybe that's a testament to the effectiveness of average citizens.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ron. Do we have any additional questions? Any more? Dr. Haslett?
Well, go ahead, Chris.
I disagree that the Healthcare Freedom Act was grassroots. I think that it had the appearance of grassrootsiness, but was almost entirely driven by the insurance companies. It was part of the lobbying effort. It was a continuation, writ small, of the effort to defeat the National Health Care Plan. And it was astroturf from the get-go, had nothing to do with actual grassroots.
Lest we forget, insurance companies were very much behind the national health care legislation. They weren't opposed to it because it cements their market power. And
Any other comments?
Yeah, I would just add, I was going to say basically the same thing, but what company would oppose a bill that forces people to buy their product? I can't imagine why any of the insurance companies would be opposed to at least that aspect of the bill. I'm sure there are things they dislike about it, but yeah, it's a mandate that says you must buy our product. Every company in the world wants that.
That's why their stocks went up.
Following that logic, I've actually asked Chris to pass a bill next term, provided the election goes Chris's way, that everyone in the state of Missouri will have to take an economics class from the university. I don't see any free market problems with that at all. Let me say one thing. Since we're getting close to the end, it's important to recognize that the views that were expressed at this table, while done in a very cogent and serious manner, are the views of the people who are at this table. There are no Show Me Institute views that were put forward here. So just in case there's any confusion that goes along with that. I'm extremely proud of the way you guys presented your ideas, and I'm honored to be associated with you. And so let me say that thanks a lot. Having said that, I'm going to drive home one more point. The important thing for the people in this state is to seriously take what's going on in Jefferson City and in their local communities, and to do this, to apply serious reasoning. What Audrey has pointed out with the Show Me Transparency basically takes the Missouri portal and makes it so much minute layers, that's an excellent place for you to go to do your own analysis on this. The IDEAS website that Chrissy has been overseeing is a collection of data across all 50 states, tax rates, a variety of other things that Chrissy would be more than happy to give you details on. This is a tool for you guys to go out and look at what's going on. These are ideas. They should be taken seriously. And we're trying to, whatever the views are of the people at this table and the people who are affiliated with the Show Me Institute, the best thing I think the Show Me Institute is one of the great things it does, is give you the tools to do your own analysis and your own thinking, and to do it in a serious manner. And so I strongly recommend, whether you agree with these people or not, at least visit the website and start learning what's going on in your state. Thanks a lot to you.
Thank you, Dr. Haslett, and thank you to our